Straight ahead on Law&Crime Daily. The murders of Reggie and Carol Sumner.
Frida Gainey did not create a monster. He chose to be one.
There's nothing that can happen in this courtroom that can undo what happened 17 years ago.
Will convicted killer Alan Wade be sentenced to death? And the Candy the Dog civil trial.
At this point, I was screaming, "Rod, get your dog, Rod, get your dog, Rod, get your dog." I yelled myself hoarse.
Hear testimony from the man responsible for Candy's death. Plus, Kevin Spacey faces multiple counts of sexual assault in a United Kingdom court. But first, accused husband killer Danielle Redlick stands trial.
You see over and over and over again the lengths that this defendant will go to avoid having to answer for what she did.
Not guilty. She did what she had to do to escape the situation.
Hear closing arguments from both sides before a verdict is reached. Law&Crime Daily covering court cases from coast to coast. Welcome everyone to Law&Crime Daily. I'm your host, Brian Buckmire. After just hours of deliberation, a verdict is reached in the trial of Florida versus Danielle Redlick, the woman accused of murdering her stepfather turned husband. Redlick is charged with second-degree murder and evidence tampering for the murder of her husband, Michael Redlich. Redlick claims she killed him in self-defense when she stabbed him in 2019. The two had been married for nearly 20 years and had 2 children together. Defense attorneys say the couple's relationship had a history of abuse and cheating. The couple had also reportedly filed for divorce by the time of Michael's death. 911 calls reveal Redlick initially told dispatchers that Michael stabbed himself and had a heart attack. Investigators say she waited several hours before calling for help the night of his death. Before a verdict was reached, jurors heard closing arguments from both sides. In his closing argument, prosecutors said Redlick's testimony was not believable.
At the end of the day, this case is in some large measure about her credibility. And what you heard is that every single statement that came out of her mouth until she sat in that chair, until she had to look you folks in the eye, was a denial of responsibility. The state of Florida submits to you that her testimony before you over the course of a day and a half was just one more attempt to avoid responsibility for her actions, to avoid not being held responsible for the murder she knew she committed as she stood over Michael with the power to call 911 in the decision not to.
In its closing argument, defense attorneys argued Redlick stabbed her husband only once in self-defense.
That man stopping her from breathing, pressing her up against the island, has his hands on her face. She pulls out the knife, she grabs the knife, and he re-engages, grabs his hand. Back goes her face, down comes the knife. She doesn't have to get away there. The only way that she's able to escape is by doing what she did. And we know that her goal was to escape because she stabbed him one time. If she's stabbing him out of hatred, ill will, spite, probably seeing more than one stab wound there. It's probably not to the shoulder.
After only several hours of deliberations, the jurors reached a verdict as to both charges.
State of Florida versus Danielle Justine Redlick. Verdict as to count 1. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. So say we all. Signed, juror badge number 283, 4%. Special finding, this page was left blank. Verdict as to count 2. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of tampering with physical evidence as charged in the information. So say we all. Signed, juror badge number 283, 4%, dated at Orlando, Orange County, Florida, on the 17th day of June, 2022.
Redlick is set to be sentenced on August 5th for the tampering with evidence conviction. The judge denied the defense's motion to release Redlich following the verdict, but she could be released on $15,000 bond pending sentence. Joining us today is forensic death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan and co-host Terri Austin. Joseph, I've been waiting to have you on to ask you this because I think a lot of people are curious about it. What exactly did Danielle Redlich hit when she stabbed her husband in order to cause him to die within 6 minutes?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. Good to be with you guys. If you begin to think about your clavicle in this particular area, there's a whole complex of blood vessels that run through there, both arteries and veins. Ms. Redlich actually clipped one of those veins, which is, of course, a return vessel that supplies the arm, and he began to bleed out into what's called the interstitial tissue. Remember, the pathologist said they couldn't measure that blood, but what's key here is that she penetrated the chest wall and went into the upper lobe of the left lung. The left lung only has 2 lobes, and he began to bleed out into that pleural space, and it prevented him from breathing. He lost about 1 liter of blood, Brian. We only have about 5 in our body.
Yeah. All right, interesting. So somewhere around here, I guess that makes sense. Now, Terri, not guilty of the 2 top counts. The defense made an argument for release, but the judge denied it. Can you explain the back and forth, and was the judge right, in your opinion?
I think the judge was wrong, and he should not have to go back to jail. You know, in Florida, tampering with evidence is 5 years. She's already served 3 1/4. The judge should have let her out on her own recognizance. And the defense counsel was trying to argue that, saying that if you apply the sentencing guidelines, she has no prior record. She's going to come back with years less than the maximum sentence. And so she should be let out. And furthermore, she's not a danger to society. So wrong decision, but hopefully she'll get out on the bond, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I would expect the defense to file what's called a writ of habeas corpus to go to a higher court. Law&Crime will be there if that happens next week to see whether or not she gets out pending a sentence. An update now on a story we first brought you here on Law&Crime Daily as New Hampshire investigators zero in on the apartment of Harmony Montgomery's father. The missing girl has not been seen for 3 years. This week, officials took a closer look at the apartment where Harmony's father, Adam Montgomery, and stepmother, Kayla Montgomery, lived. During the investigation, a refrigerator and other items were removed from the apartment, and a camera dropped down a nearby sewer pipe. Adam Montgomery is being held in jail on charges of abusing Harmony before she went missing. So far, he has not been charged in connection to her disappearance. Kayla Montgomery has been charged with fraud for collecting food stamps in Harmony's name after the girl went missing. Harmony was last seen in 2019 when living with her father and stepmother in Manchester, New Hampshire. A reward for more information about her whereabouts is set for $150,000. Still ahead on Law&Crime Daily, the man who shot and killed Candy the dog testifies in the civil trial. But first, Kevin Spacey appears in a United Kingdom court on sexual assault charges. Welcome back. Academy Award winner Kevin Spacey is granted bail as he faces 4 charges of sexual assault in the United Kingdom. Spacey, who appeared in court overseas on Thursday, was granted unconditional bail, meaning he can head back to the United States before his next court date. The actor faces charges of sexual assault dating back to 2005, 2008, and 2013, and 3 different male accusers. This isn't the actor's first run-in with claims against him. He's faced more than a dozen sexual misconduct allegations since 2017. Spacey's acting career came to an abrupt halt when actor Anthony Rapp accused him of sexually assaulting him at a party when Rapp was just a teenager. Spacey is due back in the English court on July 14th for his next hearing. Terri, what does it mean to be granted bail in this context, and what's life for Spacey going to be like until a plea or trial?
Well, you know, he's very lucky that he got that unconditional bail. It was his first appearance in the UK court, and he came voluntarily, which is probably part of the reason that the court gave him this unconditional bail. And what it means, Brian, is he is supposed to remain outside of prison while he's awaiting that trial. He has no further restrictions, and he could have gotten restrictions like having to wear an ankle bracelet or not being able to travel. So fortunately, he can travel. His next appearance, as you mentioned, is July 14th, and they've already said that he's coming back to the United States to be with his family and perhaps to work. So he'll be able to do all the things that he's been trying to do all along.
Absolutely. Now, Joseph, I know there's no death investigation here, but I want to ask you about some of the evidence. Spacey's facing charges from between 2005 to 2013. What kind of evidence do you think we can expect in a case this old and spans this long?
It's going to be very, very difficult, Brian. And remember, one of these charges is actually, and I'm paraphrasing, it's like a non-consensual penetrative sex or forced sex charge. And generally, in sexual cases like this, from a forensic standpoint, what we generally do is look for trauma that occurs within those moments. And you have to have it examined because healing takes place. And then we do sample, of course. We've all heard about rape kits. Well, this applies across the board, whether it's male or female. This has not been done to the best of my knowledge. So they're going to really be lacking on physical evidence. A lot of this stuff is going to be circumstantial, Brian.
Yeah, it's going to be a he says, he says, he says, he says of a case, right. I guess, without much science to back it up. And we'll, of course, keep eyes on this case as it continues across the pond. Coming up on Law and Crime Daily, will convicted killer Alan Wade be sentenced to death in Florida? Plus, the Candy the Dog civil trial. We head to Florida as the man who shot and killed Candy takes the stand. Welcome back. The plaintiff rests and the defendant takes the stand as the defense's first witness in the Candy the Dog civil trial, as a Florida dog owner works to bring justice for the 2016 death of his beloved companion. Ronnie Jacobson filed the civil suit against Zachary Dieterle, saying Dieterle wrongly shot his dog Candy. It happened 6 years ago on Dieterle's father's property where Jacobson stored his boat. Candy was off leash when she approached Dieterle. He claims the dog was in an attack stance. That's when Dieterle shot the dog twice with a revolver. The Sarasota County Sheriff's Office says Dieterle was not charged because he had a permit to carry the weapon, and that he was within his rights to use deadly force because he feared for his life. Jacobson says Candy had no history of aggression. He says the ultimate goal of the trial is for the Sarasota Sheriff's Office to determine the shooting was not justified and to file criminal charges against Dieterle. Dieterle testified Friday that on the day of the shooting, he saw a large pit bull as he approached Jacobson to say hello. He described what he says happened leading up to the shooting.
Did the dog coming out unexpectedly scare you?
Yes, I was certainly not expecting that walking around the property.
And what did you do in response to the dog snarling and running at you?
I immediately turned to face it. I didn't want to turn my back on what I was starting to perceive as a threat, and sort of yelled at it, sort of, hey dog, hey dog.
Did the dog come back at you after it made the first loop?
Yeah, it went back and came back in at me. At this point, I was screaming, Rod, get your dog, Rod, get your dog, Rod, get your dog. I yelled myself hoarse. I could hardly talk the next day. This is the only time I had ever had an animal react to me that way. I mean, I'm 24 years old at the time and grew up around dogs. It was strange. It was totally alien.
Terry, based on Dieterle and Jacobson's testimony, do you think officers were right not to charge Dieterle with killing Candy?
I do. I don't think the sheriff had enough information to charge any criminal case here. Based on what we've heard from Dieterle, he was afraid for his life and he did not shoot the dog, and he wasn't trying to be cruel in any way, shape, or form. In Florida, you'd have to show animal cruelty for a criminal charge, and he could have gotten jail time for that. But I think the sheriff was right because there was no torture here, there was no mutilation here. Obviously, he didn't fail to feed the dog. Those are the types of claims you'd have to show for a criminal case. Frankly, I'm not even sure they're going to be able to prove a civil case here because I do think that Dieterle made a good witness on the stand. He was a little bit arrogant, but he did make the jury feel as though he was afraid for his life.
Yeah, Joseph, I know that you are a father of 3 rescues and I'm a Dobie dad myself. So the question is, who do you believe will win in this civil case based on what you've seen so far?
I think it's going to be a very high hill to climb for the plaintiffs in this particular case, because the guy, he's stating that he did fear for his life. I think it's a tragic outcome, but I don't know that it's going to necessarily meet the standard of preponderance of evidence here to tip the scales in his way, because the guy plainly, stated that he feared for his life. He even said that Candy went into an attack stance. I don't necessarily know what that means, but for his perception, it was that the dog was about to essentially jump on him. I guess that's what he was thinking, and he drew the weapon and ended Candy's life.
Yeah, the unfortunate reality is I always tell people when you have certain dogs, they've got to be trained to an extent that other people are not fearful of them. When I say I'm a Dobie dad, I have a Doberman Pinscher, which I think most people know are somewhat intimidating dogs. And if you keep them off leash like the boxers or the pit bulls, they're loving and adoring dogs, but many people are fearful of them. So I don't see this going for the plaintiff in a very strong way, but we'll continue to see it until the verdict comes out. When we come back, a defendant is resentenced for a murder more than a decade ago. After closing statements are presented, what did a jury decide for the fate of Alan Wade? Welcome back to Law&Crime Daily. A man convicted of murder more than a decade ago will spend the rest of his life in prison instead of being put to death, as Alan Wade is resentenced in a Florida courtroom. Wade, along with 3 others, Michael James Jackson, Tiffany Cole, and Bruce Nixon, were convicted in 2008 for their involvement in the 2005 murder of Reggie and Carol Sumner. A jury found the 4 guilty of killing the couple. They kidnapped the Sumners, stole from the couple's home, then forced them into the trunk of their own car before burying them alive. 3 of the 4 were given the death penalty. Wade and Jackson are being resentenced separately after a change in Florida law, which requires a unanimous vote for the death penalty. After the jury's verdict was read, the judge brought Wade up to the bench to issue his new sentence.
Mr. Wade, you have previously been found guilty by a jury of your peers of the homicides of Carol and Reggie Sumner. Another jury of your peers having found that you should be the sentence should be imposed against you should be life imprisonment, but not death. I hereby impose that sentence. I will remand you to the custody of the Department of Corrections of the state of Florida to remain in custody for the remainder of your natural life.
Before the verdict was read and the judge resentenced Wade, both sides presented their closing arguments. Prosecutors asked jurors to keep his previous sentence, the death penalty.
Carol and Reggie Sumner, after years of loneliness, found each other and swore to each other that they would be together until death. Never could they have imagined how heinous, atrocious, and cruel those deaths would be. The terrifying ordeal at the hands of this defendant. Each and every one of you took an oath, and you swore, asking God for help, that in the right case, that you would be able to individually check the box that says death. Time in no way, shape, or form has dulled these evil acts. Your verdict will penetrate through time to forever define the punishment that is just for what he did.
Wade's defense attorney argued whatever the jury decided, that Wade will die in prison and that nothing can change the past.
No matter what you decide, you will spend the rest of his days in the concrete box of prison until he dies. Under either scenario, the punishment he receives is a harsh one. If putting Alan Wade to death would bring back the Sumners, I may do it myself. But unfortunately, that is not the way life works. There's nothing that can happen in this courtroom that can undo what happened 17 years ago.
Joseph, do you think Wade's plea to the jury in the end was what saved him?
Yeah, I suppose that it did. He got before that jury and he made his case as to why he should be allowed to live. And, you know, at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. But I take exception what counsel said right there at the end. Nothing you can do can change this. And back 15 or 17 years ago, well, the fact is it did happen. And out of all the cases I've ever covered, this is one of the most horrific.
Speaking of cases that you've covered, Joseph Scott Morgan's podcast, Body Bags, on this very case, examining the forensics in each and every detail, comes out June 21st. Make sure to check it out, and all of his phenomenal stories, many of which we cover here at the Law&Crime Daily. Terri, can you break down the verdict for us? The fact that there's no death penalty. Does that mean everyone said no death penalty, or was it kind of a mixed bag on the voting?
Well, unless we talk to the jurors, we really aren't going to know that. What we do know, Brian, is that in order to impose the death penalty in Florida, you have to have a unanimous verdict of 12. Clearly, they did not have that. So it could have been one person only, or it could have been several of the jurors who said, no, I cannot impose the death penalty. And I agree wholeheartedly. I do think that, this was heinous. The jury found that, it wasn't heinous. I agree with, Joseph. This was a heinous crime. I don't know why the jury couldn't come back with that. I think it is hard for jurors to impose the death penalty. They said it was cold and calculated. They didn't think it was heinous. It was heinous. And look, it only took them 3.5 hours. So clearly some of those jurors already made up their mind even before they went back in that room. And it's hard to convince a jury to go another way on the death sentence.
Yeah, it's hard to get that death penalty sentence on many of these cases, and I think the defense pushed it pretty well to win for their clients. Thank you both for always coming, and thank you for joining us here at Law&Crime Daily. We'll see you next time as we discuss justice in America.